No mean city. Some thoughts about Leeds and being brought up in the provinces. To have been born and brought up in a northern provincial city seemed in those days more of a handicap than an inheritance. How, I think at the time, how will I ever get out of here? Who in this place has ever come to anything? And, a question that has cropped up from time to time since, where is life? In those days the answer to that seemed to be down south, capital D, capital S, certainly not in the West Riding, dark, rainy, ringed by mills and wild moors. And if not down south, then the North and East Riding seem more of a promised land, if only because life there is a bit more up my imaginary street. Go east of Leeds, and certainly beyond York, and there are smiling cottages round village greens, duck ponds, and even the occasional thatched roof, with only the busy red buses of the West Yorkshire Road Car Company, terminus on Wellington Street opposite the Central Station, to remind one that this is home still, and mucky Leeds not far off. Past York there's a prospect of distant hills and sunlit uplands, Harriet country these days, and home of Heartbeat, and then the moors you cross to get to Whitby or Scarborough. In other ridings than ours there are soaring churches and grand gateways into great parks that promise Palladian houses and glimpses of that storybook world that as a child I always hanker after. Leeds, though, is different, and it's being brought up in a city that is almost entirely of the 19th century that makes me, as a boy, famished for antiquity, and long to get away from Leeds so that I can find some. What I do not appreciate, though, is how deeply the city puts its stamp on me. No child brought up in Leeds or any large provincial city can help but be aware that his or her life is underpinned and overseen by the corporation. The arms of the city of Leeds are embossed on public library books and on the exercise books we write in at school. They're emblazoned on the side of the trams and on the dust carts. Any public celebration sees medallions with the arms of the city fixed to lamp-posts and public buildings, and even strung across the streets in the city centre. There was, and it's still there, a coat of arms fixed to the wrought iron tracery over the entrance to the city markets in Kirkit. Another, more battered one, survives over the hedgerow entrance to what was then the police department and the city reference library. The arms can even be found growing in Roundy Park, where, together with the floral clock, the owl and the lamb are painstakingly planted out in alyssum and lobelias by the Corporation Parks Department. Thus it is that a child is reminded of the identity of the city at every turn, much as, and I don't think the comparison is fanciful, much as a 15th century citizen of Florence or Venice was reminded in the same way. This presence of the corporation in our lives is constant and largely benevolent. A reasonable performance in higher school certificate or any acceptance by university means, for instance, that a boy or girl is automatically awarded a scholarship by the city. Slightly better results produce a scholarship from the state, but the city educates its own, and any award by a college or university, art school, drama school or whatever, is topped up as a matter of course by the Corporation Education Department, with its imposing offices opposite the side door of the Town Hall in Carverley Street. The effect of this continuing corporation presence is to instil, even in the most heedless of its children, a sense of belonging. And it isn't the same as the windy stuff about pride in the school that we're regularly regaled with at morning assembly. No one takes that seriously for a moment. But it is a kind of pride, and though one wouldn't have wanted to think so or be told so then, a boy or girl nurtured in Leeds or Bradford or Manchester has some sense of being a son or daughter of a solid, self-confident city, and that when in due course one went away, as I did, to university, the sense of being still part of the city, like it or not, is in one's baggage. And of course for me and for most of my schoolfellows, everything we have in the way of education has been provided for us free of charge. My education, elementary school, secondary school, university, cost my parents nothing. Their only sacrifice, which they don't see as a sacrifice, that by staying on at school beyond 16 I'm not bringing in a wage. Education in its wider sense is free too. The libraries are free, open every day except Sunday from 9 in the morning until 8 at night. The art gallery is free, the museums, even symphony concerts are virtually free, a school ticket to sit behind the orchestra in 1950 costing sixpence. The rightness and appropriateness of this is not questioned by either of the political parties on the City Council, though the orchestra, which is less generally acceptable, is starved of funds by both. So much, though, we take for granted, and in my view rightly, it being, it seems to me, the mark of a civilised society that certain privileges should be taken for granted, such as education, health care, and the safety to walk the streets, and to have pleasant streets to walk in. Though there is much that irritates, saddens, and angers me about Leeds and what has happened to it since, I shall always be grateful for what I was given there. And so, when, particularly in the 80s, one found a different so-called philosophy prevailing, namely that people properly value only what they pay for, I remember my growing up in Leeds and what we were given then, and want none of it. To find much of that conservative thinking now embraced by the Labour Party, in particular where education is concerned, is especially bitter. Of course it has to be paid for, but to say education has to be paid for and the students must pay for it is not the same thing. As I say, my parents paid not a penny for my education, but had they been told that in order to go to university I must take out a loan, however reasonably it could be repaid, so strong is their fear of debt, I would not have been allowed to go, nor, I'm sure, would many of my contemporaries. I would be surprised if this is not the case still in many households today, and I think it's wrong. Of course, I keep saying that our education was free, though there is a sense in which it was not free at all, as it had already been paid for by what had been withheld from our parents and grandparents, packed, in Larkin's words, into close-ribbed streets that rise and fall like a great sigh out of the last century. Our education was not free. It was owing. It was our birthright because it had not been theirs. Now I'm not sure anyone has a birthright, or what a birthright means. The proud municipal tradition I've been talking about has gone, began to crumble, I suppose, in the 60s, when the great provincial cities started to tear themselves apart in the name of profit and redevelopment, so that by the end of the 70s, one place looked very much like another. Long since gone are those grand officials whose names never seemed to change throughout my childhood. George Guest, the Director of Education, W. Vane Morland, the Director of Transport, R.A.H. Livett, the Director of Housing. Names that I remember, and which I see Leeds-born Keith Waterhouse, slightly older than I am, remembers too. They were the municipal pillars of my youthful Leeds world, their names as constant and unchanging as Tyrrell of Avon, the film censor, whose certificate preceded every film one ever saw, or H.O. Pepiat, the Secretary of the Bank of England, whose signature authenticated every note. Grand and mysterious personalities who peopled one's childhood, and through endless years the same. The downfall of these municipal great men was handily symbolised when, in an architectural salvage warehouse in Elland in 1988, I saw, stacked up, the fixtures and fittings of the Leeds Corporation Education Department. So the panelling that used to deck out the office of the redoubtable George Guest, to whom I and many others of my age owe our education, now graces some converted barn in Wensleydale, or kits out some modish design consultancy, canal side. The accent, of course, doesn't seem to change. A Leeds accent not at all rough-sounding to me, but rather wet and lackadaisical. I tried to lose my northern accent at one period, the 50s, I suppose, when the provincial voice was still looked down on. Then it came back, and now I don't know where I am, sometimes saying my A's long, sometimes short, though it's the U's that are a continuing threat. Words like butcher, study, sugar, names like Cutbush, always lying in ambush. Once, in the 70s at Cambridge, I did a recital with Judi Dench, northern herself, but from York, which is rather different. I had to read a passage by Goldsmith about Garrick. He cast off friends as a huntsman his pack, for he knew when he pleased he could whistle them back. Of praise a mere glutton, he swallowed what came, and here it comes, the puff of a dunce, he mistook it for fame. On the night in question I had to have 2 stabs at that phrase, the first time saying the puff of a dunce, and the second time the puff of a dunce, thereby, I'm sure, causing a good deal of pain to Dady Rylands, one of the last survivors of Bloomsbury, who was directing the proceedings. Dame Judy didn't help by openly sniggering. The truth is, anyone from the north who ventures south of the Trent contracts an incurable disease of the vowels. It's a disease to which weather forecasters are particularly prone, and lecturers, for some reason, in sociology.